All right, thank you everyone for coming to my talk. Thank you very much. This is my first conference talk, so very excited for this one. I'm going to be talking about this tool called Remult, which I have a couple live demos for, and obviously the talk is titled Meet Your New BFF, because honestly, I do kind of feel like I've met my new BFF in my web development full stack journey, and I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, some of you feel similarly. Please. Hi, I'm Dev, and I'm a dev. The irony of that is not lost on me, trust me. These are kind of the 4 big projects that I've worked on, either as a solo developer or in a pretty large capacity. And I've been writing like full stack JavaScript applications for 7 years or so. And while I've certainly worked on a few more projects, these are kind of the big projects that I draw a lot of my experience and a lot of my learnings from. And I'm going to use one of them in this talk later. I'm also a dev rel. I currently work as a developer advocate at Clerk, where we are building full authentication and user management solution for React and Next.js projects. So if you're interested in that, please do come and talk to me after this talk. It's a lot of talks. And I'm also a content creator. On my YouTube channel, I make some videos on software development, on architecture. I talk a lot about JavaScript and web development as well. And on X, formerly known as Twitter, I mostly just shitpost, but I have sometimes valuable things to say as well. Cool. So, kind of want to start with this sentiment that there was a point where I felt like web development was easy. Now, I'm not saying this as like a general comment to the industry. I haven't been around for like 15, 20 years, like a lot of people to say that, oh, back in 2000s, we had Rails and everything was so quick and easy to do. I'm mostly talking about my experience. One of the first frameworks that I kind of fell in love with that I used quite a bit was Meteor. I don't know how many of you have know about it or have used it in any projects. But it's this full stack framework. It still exists, obviously, and I'm not, like, this talk is not about Meteor. That's not what I'm advocating for. But the first project that I built, the healthcare platform, it was basically a complete online kind of job portal where you could go and create a profile and find jobs, or you could go and like create job listings and get matched with people who have similar profiles, and you could talk to them, you could get hired, you could even directly get paid on that platform. And as someone who had basically no professional experience and only had maybe 1 or 2 years of like learning through side projects and like through online blog posts and tutorials and stuff, this was obviously not a trivial to-do application to build, but it was still kind of a complex project, and I was able to like build a lot of it as a solo developer because of this tight full stack experience that Meteor offered. And in hindsight, I think I'm pretty convinced that a lot of it was because there was no glue code, no duct tape involved. And I'm going to talk more about what I mean by glue code soon. After that project, when I started moving on to other projects, when I got a full-time job, when I looked at more code bases, things that were using quote-unquote real industry standard professional tools like Node.js, things seem to get more difficult to do instead of easier, which is kind of counterintuitive as someone getting into the industry as a new person. Obviously, a lot of these mean, mern, pern stacks and the 200 different variations of these were all the hype, and probably still are if you're in any kind of a full stack JavaScript shop. We probably have this Postgres MongoDB database using React or Angular, and you're using Express or Fastify, something like that. And as I was getting into these projects and I was starting to contribute to some of these code bases, I felt like I was spending like half of my time or more than half of my time just trying to glue these disjointed parts of the stack together. So what does that look like? This is kind of what I mean by glue code, where you're probably going to have some operations, some functions on your server side, on your backend, that are almost certainly going to be doing some CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. Maybe there's more orchestration logic in some of them, but a lot of our applications probably just tend to be CRUD. And then we have those functions registered as API endpoints, with all the HTTP shenanigans like parsing out parameters and body and sending status codes. And then same thing on the front end, where you have service calls or service methods that invoke the same HTTP endpoints that you just created. And once again, deal with the HTTP shenanigans of putting everything in headers, parameters, and payloads, and then making sure you parse everything out. Now, this here is not a lot of code. The problem with this kind of code is that we tend to write a lot of it. The first problem here is that we have kind of the same concepts of get to-dos and create to-do represented in our application like 3 different times. It's probably going to be more if you have another layer for your database abstraction, if you have repositories or anything like that. And then we have to write this code for every piece of data for our application. And at some point, it becomes very complicated to try to keep track of everything, to keep track of control flows, because they all just end up keep talking to each other. And then the bigger problem is not just having all of this code, it's the adjacent concerns like authentication, like validation. Where are you putting all of that logic in your code? It's probably going to be spread across the entire stack. Complex queries is one that I've dealt with quite a bit, because now you're no longer just sending a GET request to receive all the data. You now have this giant blob of filters and pagination parameters or sorting that you have to send back, that you have to transform, you have to validate, and you have to translate into 3 different types of layers so that you make sure you have you can represent them as JSON for your API, but then you have to translate them to SQL, and it gets very weird. And then you have to do it for, once again, every piece of data that you have in your application. And then, of course, every caller, every piece of operation has to have its own error handling, and then you have all of it glued together. And once you go back into the code base, or worse, once someone else goes into your code base, debugging is kind of fun, and finding the business logic in all of this, like throughout the stack is going to be even more fun. My proposal is simple. Let's stop reinventing CRUD. Maybe we don't need to represent the same CRUD operations or implement the same CRUD operations 5 times in our stack in different technologies, in different concerns. Maybe we can collapse all of those adjacent concerns into a single source of truth instead of having it spread across the stack, and then having it all glued together. And maybe we can try to collapse everything into a single source of truth in our application. And I'm going to demo what that looks like. But this is essentially what Remult, the tool that I'm talking about today, allows us to do. It helps us have this very simple mental model where we have our entity, which is the single source of truth for most of the application concerns. And then we have our actual application, which is your user interface, which is your API endpoints. And your application just interacts with the entity, and you don't have 5 different layers of abstraction that all handle the same feature, just in different ways. And at this point, I'm just going to jump into the demo and hope that the display doesn't break too often, because this is really probably the fastest way to show the power of Remult. So I'm going to start this application here. Now what I have here is a simple React application. It's just a to-do app, because to-dos are simple. Nothing complicated to understand there. I'm going to open this up, and hopefully it opens up there. There we go. There's nothing too fancy, just a simple to-do app. It doesn't work at all. So if I type anything, press enter, press add, nothing's going to happen. All I have here is some React files. Here we do have a use query. If you're using React, you're probably using React query. If not, please start using React query. But all it's doing here is we just return an empty array. We're not making a call to fetch data from a server or from a database yet. And this is our form for adding new to-dos. We have our loading state, and then for each to-do, we are going to render the task component. That's it. One more, and we also have kind of a backend file that does really nothing. We just initialize a new Express app, but then just leave it alone. And this is just for development environment. because we're using Vite as a bundler. Vite will bundle the React application into static files, and then these will be served from here. So the backend is really doing nothing other than serving our React application. The only other thing we have here is if we go to our, I'm going to get rid of that. And here we have this type of task. And this is just a class here, which has an ID, title, completed, created at. That's it. So we're going to bring in Remult here and see what we can do. Now we can define this to be an entity. Now the basic idea of Remult is that it's kind of like an ORM. If you've used type ORM, you're probably going to feel pretty much at home here because of the use of decorators and classes. If not, don't worry, there is a way to use Remult without decorators for the, because I know some people are just passionately against decorators. I don't know why, but they exist. So yeah, we can define this task class to be an entity. We're just going to give it a name. And like with most ORMs, we would need to define what fields there are. So we can say this is fields UUID. This is going to be automatically generated whenever there's a new task. We can say title is fields.string. Completed is going to be fields.boolean. And created at is going to be fields, not field, .date. All right, pretty straightforward so far. Nothing too fancy going on. Now, when you use some sort of an ORM, once you create an entity, you can probably create a repository out of that entity, so you can do CRUD operations on that. And this all usually happens on the server side. But the special power of Remult is that you can actually do it on the client side. So I can create a task. That is not a const. I can create a tasks repo. And I can say that this is Remult, which I have auto import on, remult.repo, and I'm just going to give it the task class. Again, this is something that you probably usually do in the server-side code, but here we can just do it on the front end. And then instead of doing this empty array, we can just do task repo dot find, and this is going to run the find operation. And you probably noticed here, if I do a dot, you have access to like most of the CRUD operations right here in your client side. So if I do this, let's save it, and let's see if this works. Refresh. Well, no, it's stuck at loading because there's one more thing that we just need to do, which let's go on our backend. Now in our Express application, we can create we can create an API, and this is going to come from Remult Express. So this once again comes from this comes from Remult, and I'm going to do just a bit of setup, and then I'm going to explain what this is doing. I'm going to tell Remult Express that we are dealing with the task entity, so we're going to import it here, and then all we have to do is to plug it into our Express application as any other middleware. So here, the Remult Express takes all of our entities that we're dealing with, which in this case is just a task. It creates an API for them, which we can then plug into our Express. And now if we go back to our application, voila, we have data. And this data comes from a server database. And if we look at our network tab, we're going to see that the .find that we were doing is making a get call to /API/tasks, and it's getting a response which has all of these to-dos. How did all of this happen? Well, when we created this Remult Express API, it automatically generated a /API/tasks endpoint for the task entity, which has all the CRUD operations already in there. And then when we create the repository on the front end or on the client side, it simply interacts with that REST endpoint, which on the server side, it would just interact over a database connection and send SQL data. Here, it's interacting over the REST endpoint. So pretty sweet. Let's see what else we can do here. We have our add task function. Right now, it's not doing anything. Hello, JS and friends. Add, well, it's not doing anything yet. So let's come back here and let's implement this. I'm gonna add a try catch in here. Good practice usually. Simple. Really, all I have to do is say task repo.insert and give it the title. and I can do query client.invalidate queries tasks. So this is going to tell React Query to go ahead and refetch this one, which is going to fetch a new list of to-dos from the repository, and we're going to have it on the UI. Final thing is going to add the catch, and I'm just going to throw up an alert for now. Obviously, real projects, you're going to want to use like UI notifications, proper UI feedback for these. But here I'm just going to throw an alert. And now let's try to add a to-do. So if we click add, we get a forbidden error, of course. So I know as soon as I, pretty much anytime someone says that, oh, we just gave CRUD operations access to the client, everyone's brain going to be like, oh no, that is so insecure. Well, I agree, which is why I think by default, all kind of like write operations to your data is forbidden by Remult. So all we have to do here is let's go back to our entity. And now to our entity, because this is the idea of the single source of truth, which means most of your rules that you need for your to-dos, they should be defined right here. So here I can give it a second parameter, and this has a property called allow API CRUD. I'm going to set it to true for now, and let's come back here and let's try this again. Hello, JS and friends. There we go. Our to-dos work now. I can add these as many times. So this basically told Remult that, okay, give the API or give the front end access to all the CRUD operations on tasks. For now, we're going to change it soon. All right, so once we have this set, and now we can come here and we can also create more to-dos. Let's implement some other operations and see how quick that is. So we're going to come back here, going to collapse here, and now this is the task component, which is responsible for showing the individual rows for each to-do. And you can see we have a set completed function, which is called when you click on the checkbox, and we have the delete task function, which is called when you click on the X. So let's come down here once again. Really all we have to do here is set task.completed to the new completed value, and then await task repo.save the new task. And that's pretty much it. Everything outside of that is just UI concerns of invalidating the task query. And then we can add our catch error handler here, any. And once again, let's just throw up an alert with error.message. And for now, we can just copy this for delete task. But instead of doing that, instead of doing the delete, or instead of doing the save, we just need to do tasks repo.delete. So that basically took a few seconds to implement. And let's see if it works. There we go. We can check tasks. We can remove them. And that's pretty slick. One thing that I forgot to add is I'm just going to come down here and do a form.reset. Form.reset, there we go. I'm starting to use more DOM APIs now because it turns out that the browser already implements a lot of things that we try to implement on our own. So maybe try the native implementations. There we go. Hello, friends. Yeah, so we have a function. We had a functioning to-do application, and it was relatively quick to implement because of this idea that we just have our entities that are defined kind of as a single source of truth, and we have these CRUD operations available on the entity on the full stack directly on the client. We can also do this exact same thing on the server, and we'll have access to the same APIs, but instead of like doing the find or create over a REST API, it would just do it directly with the database. So that is the first demo that I have. Hope that was helpful in trying to understand what Remult does exactly. And let's now explore this further, what we can do. Right now we have our data model, which was our task class. We defined all the fields into it, and we have our application that does CRUD operations on top of it. Now, there's certainly a class of applications out there that only need this, and I've built applications like this, where really all I need is this. I don't need any fancy validation or authorization on top of it. but most of us are probably not building applications like those at our day jobs. So we're certainly going to need to add more things on top of it. We're going to want to restrict access to that data model to certain users with certain roles or permissions or things like that. So let's just add our auth rules in our entities, because why not? That's our single source of truth. And while we're at that, maybe we can also add validation to make sure that you cannot just create empty to-dos, or you cannot create a to-do with the created add date that's like too far into the future. Maybe we don't want to allow things like that. And maybe just validation rules are not enough. Maybe you also want to restrict that once you have created a to-do, the only thing you can change is the completed value, and maybe you're not allowed to change a lot of other things. Maybe you don't want it to get into invalid states, and we can just add invariants right there. But maybe if you have domain rules like that, where we want to make sure our data doesn't get into an invalid state, or you can only make changes to the data with specific business operations. You might have heard like rich domain models and those ideas thrown around quite a bit. We can also add those in our entities directly and keep our application free of those concerns, and we still have this very simple model of our application interacts with the entities. That's pretty much it. And this is where I have a second demo. I'm going to undo everything that I just did. I'm going to go to a different branch, and I'm going to start this up. Now, this is basically the exact same as what I just built. The only difference is that I've added some authentication here using Clerk, obviously, because the built-in components are just really nice. Like this user profile, it just looks pretty good. But I'm going to sign out here, and I still have access to this. Yep. Now maybe we don't want this. We want to protect the application, so only signed in users have access to the to-dos. So let's start doing this. The first thing we can do, actually don't need this. First thing we can do is go into our entity, and let's just change it to false for now and see what happens. Now it gets stuck into a loading state, and if I try to add anything, this should not work, and we get a forbidden error as expected. So that's sorted out, but what we want to do here is set it to allow dot. Let's import allow dot authenticated. Now, what this does is that if you're not signed in, obviously you won't have access to anything. So if we come back here, this is still stuck on loading, and we still cannot do anything. Yep. But once you're signed in, it should give you access to the CRUD operation. So let's see what that looks like. We're gonna log in with Google here. I'm signing with my Gmail account. So yeah, I signed in with my Gmail account, although I still don't have access to anything. Can I add something? No, I still don't. Because now one little thing that we still need to do is we actually need to tell Remult if a user is signed in or not. And we can do that here in our Remult Express application, because that's where everything is bootstrapped. This is still the exact same as before. The only difference is that we now have a Clerk middleware, which is going to look at the cookies, parse the JWT information, and it's going to attach it to the request.auth object. Here we need to pass it a get user function, which is going to take the request, that HTTP request object. And here we need to just use the request object to figure out if there is a user signed in. And if there is, let's see how that's done first. So we can do request.auth.user_ID. Now this is again put there by the Clerk middleware, but if you're using any kind of authentication middleware, I think it's kind of pretty standard that you're going to parse the session information and put that either in request.auth or request.session. Now here, if the user ID exists, if we hover over it, we say that it's either string or null. It's going to be string if the user is signed in, null if the user is not signed in. If they are signed in, we just need to return an object that has the user ID in there. And this is going to tell Remult that there is a signed in user. And now if we come back here, we now have access to this because we are signed in and we have a user ID. Let's go. And if I sign out, it's stuck on a loading and I cannot add anything. So we have our basic authentication set up here, where once you're signed in, you have access to things here. What else can we do? Maybe we want to keep track of who created the tasks so that you only have access to your tasks and not someone else's tasks. So let's add a user ID in here. It's going to be a string, fields dot string here. And while we're here, let's add some validation in here. So let's say we want the title validate to be validators dot required. Once again, this comes from Remult, but you also don't need to specifically use these rules because these are just simple functions that, and you can implement your own custom validation if you want. Here we're just going to specify that the title is required. We're going to say that the user ID is also required. Well, I keep mistyping this. Validators.required. And let's say for the creator that we want a default value to be new date. So it's just a function that's going to run every time we create a new to-do, and it's going to give us the current date here. This is by default set to false, so don't really think we need to do anything here. And now let's save this and see what we can do. First, obviously, we need to sign in, because if not, Remult is just going to reject it straight up. I'm going to sign in with my Gmail account once again, and I cannot add things anymore because the user ID should not be empty. So now I need to go to my to-do application, and when we are inserting something into the to-dos repo, we want to make sure that it has a user ID. And this user ID can come from a user object, which comes from a user hook. This is a clerk hook. Clerk is like really focused on making the React experience like the best possible. So there's pre-built components, there's hooks that'll give you data instead of a lot of auth libraries being, oh, here's a bunch of HTTP endpoints you can call. Good luck. And now here I can just say user.id is my user ID. Now let's see if this works. Does it work now? Perfect. So now we can add things and say hello to JSNF. Perfect. So we can now add to-dos with our user IDs in the database. And I can check things. I can probably delete things. Yeah. But now if we try to sign out, and let's sign in from a different account. So this time I'm going to sign in with my clerk account instead of Gmail. There we go. Now I did add this to do with my other Gmail account. The name and profile are the same, so it might get a little confusing. I'm sorry about that. But maybe I should probably not have access to check it or delete it, or I probably shouldn't even see this to do. So let's quickly add those rules and see what that looks like. Now here we had our allow API CRUD, but we also have, if I type in allow, you're going to see we have some more fine-grained control over how we want to allow those operations. So let's set the update property. This is going to be a function that gives us the task. And what we can do is task.userid should be the same as remult. I need to import remult first. remult.user.id. Now, whenever there's a request, Remult will store the user object in here so that you can do things like these. And this task is the entity that we are trying to update right now. Let's save it and see if this works. Now, I cannot check this to do anymore. Perfect. Because this to do was created by the other user account. Let's quickly copy and paste this and use it for allow API delete as well. So I should not be able to delete this. Perfect. The other one also I cannot delete it. Nice. But if I create my own to-do, hello from clerk, I am able to do those things for this to-do because I created it. And the final thing is we probably just don't want to show this. And for that, we can add an API pre-filter here. This is going to be, this actually doesn't receive any arguments. Here we are going to check if there is a currently logged in user. And if there is, we're going to return an object that has the user ID of remult.user.id. And if not, we're just going to return an empty object. So basically, the API pre-filter is called before you make any sort of get queries or find queries, and it's automatically going to add this kind of like where clause or this filter whenever you make queries. So you can make sure that I don't see any tasks because I didn't create anything yet. Oh, the one that I did, I deleted it. So once again, I'm going to add hello from clerk, and I can only see this to do instead of everything else. If I sign out, I can sign back in with my Gmail account right here, and I can only see the tasks that I created. I cannot see the ones that were created from the different account. Perfect timing this time. And you missed nothing. Awesome. So again, that covers like 90-95% of auth cases that I've run into for most of my projects. And it still allows me to keep that very simple mental model of my application and my entity, and I didn't have to spend a lot of time like writing a lot of API endpoints. And obviously, all of this still works for the REST API, so you can even just take this REST API and give it to someone else, and they can just call it without even using Remult. So you still have that option. One final thing I would like to show here is we also have access to role-based authentication. So in here, maybe we just get rid of task and we say remult.user.roles.includes admin. And we can even do things like this, where we're checking for an admin role in the user object, and we're using that for deciding if someone has delete permissions or update permission. So we change the allow API delete to simply say the user role should include admin. And if the admin isn't included there, we're allowing them to delete. And if the user is not an admin, we're not giving them any delete permissions. So you also have access to do abilities to do like fine-grained role-based authentication in here. I'm going to switch this back to our owner permission for now. Cool. One final thing that I wanted to show here for Remult is adding some invariants. So one more thing that certainly I don't like to have in my application is things like these, where you can just set any property within a class, any property within your data model to anything else, and then get out, and then call save on it. So let's move this also into our class to kind of keep that mental model of single source of truth, but also rich domain models where most of the updates that are made to your class are through your methods, so that it's always easy to see what's happening to your class, and you don't have a lot of other things constantly changing the properties. So let's add a method here called toggle completed, and all we're going to do is this.completed is the opposite of this.completed. Once we have this, we can change this to just be task.toggleCompleted. Cool. Well, now we have this. Maybe we don't even need to call the await save. So one thing we can add on top of this is let's make sure this class extends ID entity, which comes from Remult. And what this allows us to do is that in methods like these, I can literally just do await this.save. So kind of like the active record pattern, I can make this an async function. And now this, when I call the toggle completed class, it's just going to save itself to the database, which means if I go back here, I don't even need this line here anymore. And all we have to do is to call the method here. I'm going to remove that line. I'm going to add one more thing. Toggle completed. There. So I'm going to add a console login here to show that we are calling the method on the entity instead of doing anything here. And let's see if this still works. I'm going to pull up the console, inspect console. All right, so this still works, and you can see the log in our console for toggle completed, which we just added in our entity method. Because really all it's doing is that it's just calling this method here like it's just how regular classes work. But now we did move our logic from our application to our entity, but all of this update logic is still running on the client, which means we still have given the client, the front end client or the API client, all the update access to our entities. Maybe in some cases we don't want to do that. So let's change this to false so that we can make sure that the users or the front end clients cannot just make any changes to the data as they please. And now if we come here, obviously, when we try to update something, we're going to get a forbidden error because, yeah, we just turned the update access to false. But now here's one of the really nice things about Remult is that I can take this method here and I can just add a decorator called backend method, and I can set allowed to true. Let's see what it's doing here. So if we switch back to our application, even though we have the update permissions turned off, we can still do this. The console log that we had for toggle completed, it doesn't appear in the console anymore. There we go. So I'm doing a bunch of this, and it works, even though the update permission is turned off. And you might have noticed that the toggle completed console log didn't appear in the console, because what's happening is the backend method decorator that we added, it just kind of magically turned that method into an API endpoint. And from the front end, when we didn't change any code on the client side, we just did task.toggle completed. But instead of calling that method, it sent an API endpoint, or it sent an API call to the backend, which then triggered that method on the server side. Here, you're going to see toggle completed console on the server now instead of on the client, because this is being invoked on the client. Now this has its own allow permissions. This doesn't necessarily follow the permissions of the entity that it's set on. So we're going to have to kind of every backend method that you have in an entity or whatever in your code, it's going to need its own permission. So you're going to have to set allowed, true, allowed, false, or whatever based on, let's say, the user ID, like we were doing for the specific update operations. Yeah, I think that's really it that I had for this second demo. But yeah, so far the point again has been that the mental model is kind of simple. We have our entity and we have our application, and all these authentication rules, validation rules, or update logic, all of that can just go into our entity, and we can directly interact with them on our client using the repository. Those are the demos. One of my favorite things about Remult is its ports and adapters kind of style design. You might have noticed that we never did any database setup when we set up our new application, right? Our backend was an Express app that did nothing. We just added Remult to it, and we also just had a database in there, because Remult by default uses a JSON database. The Remult entities kind of sit on a completely abstracted layer from everything else. And of course, if you've heard of ports and adapters or hexagonal architecture, clean architecture, you probably might have. And that's kind of the design that Remult follows. It will by default use the JSON database, and it generated the REST endpoints for us. But obviously, that's the whole point of ports and adapters, is that you can keep the core of your application completely decoupled from the infrastructure concerns, like from what database it's running on, how you're interacting with it, how you're sending those messages to it. But what that means is that you're not limited to the JSON database. You can plug Remult into any sort of a SQL database you want, and most of those adapters are offered out of the box by the maintainers. So you can plug it into a Postgres database. You can plug it into a query builder like Connects, which will then allow you to plug it into MySQL, into SQL Server, or even Oracle, if people are still using it. There's a MongoDB adapter. And one of the cooler parts about Remult still is that you're not even limited to interacting over the REST API, because Remult can generate a GraphQL API for you if you want to publish that. It can generate OpenAPI documentation for the REST APIs it created, so that you can publish the documentation and give it to other teams who don't wanna use JavaScript or who don't want to use Remult and still talk to your application. And the really cool feature is the live query feature, which allows you to build real-time applications. I can just do my task repo.subscribe, and I can get real-time updates from my server on the client through server-sent events. And even that's sitting on an abstract layer, because you might be in a stateless or a serverless environment where you don't have access to server-sent events or WebSockets. And in that case, you can just plug in an adapter for something like Ably, which is a third-party platform for building real-time applications. At this point, let me quickly see if I can go through the docs here. Let's see. Yeah, so connecting to the database, you can see all the database options that we have here. Once again, the Postgres one is built in. Most of the times you're probably using Postgres. And when adding to our application, we added to an Express backend, but there's, again, built-in adapters for Fastify. There's built-in adapters for Next.js, both Pages and App Router. There's one for SvelteKit. And Nest and Koa just use Express under the hood, so you're just using the Express middleware there. And obviously on the client side, because it's just giving you functions asynchronous functions, it can integrate with anything. You can put it in the React application, in Angular, in Vue, in Svelte, pretty much whatever you're using. So this ports and adapters design really enables Remult to be almost completely stack agnostic. Obviously, I can sing praises about Remult for the whole day if you let me, but it won't be a fair talk if I don't kind of address some limitations. Like with any tool that does a lot of work under the hood, you might run into some issues with flexibility if you because the Remult entities, they're complete. Let's see, I had notes for this part. I should have kept them up. But obviously, if you're using Remult, you might run into cases where you don't necessarily agree with how Remult is doing something. You want some additional flexibility that it's not offering. So that's going to be a small issue when you're writing Remult. The bigger problem, at least for me, is how much Remult depends on isomorphic code. Isomorphic basically means the code runs both on the client and the server, and our Remult entities, as you might have seen, exist both on the server code and are also bundled into the client. So if you want to do things like interacting with third-party APIs with secure credentials, or if you want to talk to the file system or do file uploads, you want to bring in heavy libraries to do encryption or hashing, those things you can't really do within Remult entities, because those are going to be packaged into the client bundle as well. Luckily, the framework authors or the Remult authors have thought about this, and they've specifically designed Remult to be a library, not a framework. What does that mean? That it doesn't own your entire stack. A lot of these full stack CRUD capabilities you can also get if you're using something like Firebase or Supabase, and I've used both of them, and they're fantastic tools, but they just have their different use cases. They will kind of own your entire stack. Like once you start writing a Firebase application, you probably have to use Firebase for everything. Remult is not like that. Remult is just a library, which means you can bring it in for the parts of your application where it makes sense. And for the other parts of your application, you can still use all the other tools that you have. It is pretty highly extensible. So if there are properties, if there are things in there that you need that are not there yet, you can add them. For example, for the user object, if I don't just want an ID and roles, maybe I also want to add the organization ID or the team ID, the team that the user is a part of, so that I can use that to further add more role-based authorization. I can add that. There's ways to add it. I forget how to, but they have a lot of documentation on how to do some of those things with Remult. There's also ways to use server-only dependencies within your Remult entities. I'm not honestly a big fan, which is why I'm not bringing it up here. But again, there are ways to do it with Remult. And obviously, the big benefit is that it fits everywhere, which means you're not really going to run into those questions of, okay, does it work with my current stack? Does it work with the tools that I have? Because the answer is probably yes. And before you ask, yes, it scales. This is kind of the big evidence of that. This application was created by the Remult authors, and this was, I think, created in 2018, 2019. It operates in Israel, and it kind of handled like a few hundred food deliveries at that point. But then when the pandemic hit, suddenly the requirement for food delivery skyrocketed, and this application went from a few hundred deliveries to a few 100,000 deliveries. And that was a good test, and it was initially built in Remult. Remult was kind of actually born out of this application, and it was a pretty good test to see if a library like that can handle not only such a rapidly growing scale, but also rapidly growing needs for when something goes from 100 deliveries to 100,000 users. The requirements and the expectations change a lot, and that was a pretty good test to see if an application built on Remult can stand that evolution. That's pretty much all that I have. The last slide just has the website URL. There we go, remult.dev. And yeah, I'm hoping that was an interesting tool for you guys to check out. If it is, you can check it out on this website. And I'll take questions now. Thank you.